Hello everybody, Disciple here once again with Hearthstone Curios. So in the newest Ungrow expansion, we've seen that the Elemental tribe has finally been added to the game, with some synergies between them with the played last turn mechanic. But did you guys know that the Elemental tribe was actually already in the game, or at least considered at some point in the past? That's right, Elementals and actually many other minion archetypes were experimented with a ton in the early development of the game, but most, if not pretty much all of them were cancelled, with only Mech and now Elemental being added back into the game at a later date, with Dragon, Pirate, and Murloc making it into the game at the very beginning, but with pretty much no synergy between them except with the Murlocs and the South Sea Captain. Of course, we've gotten a lot of those synergies added into the game, but it actually wasn't until Blackrock Mountain, when we first got Dragon synergy, that we actually saw that start to happen. We actually know about pretty much all of the archetypes that did get cancelled in the past, so today we thought we'd go over each one briefly and also talk about what these archetypes could have meant for Hearthstone as a whole. So let's get right into it. Pretty much all of the races from World of Warcraft were in the game as an archetype at some point, and first up it's the Blood Elves. So the Blood Elves used to be known as the High Elves, but after most of their kind were killed when the Scourge attacked Kalthalas, they basically renamed their race to the Blood Elves, and although we do see quite a few Blood Elves in Hearthstone, both in cards and in the hero Valeera Sanguinar, Blood Elves don't really have any lore or abilities that would make them work super well as a synergistic tribe, and so while we'll likely see more Blood Elves on cards, we might not see them returning as a card type. However, if we were to, maybe it would copy something similar to how the elves work in Magic the Gathering, where elves are typically a little weak on their own, but when they're used together, they do boost each other up. Although this is very similar to the Murloc mechanic that we currently have in the game today. What could also be cool is a racial ability that triggers when you fulfill a certain criteria, like playing enough of a certain race. In World of Warcraft, Blood Elves all have an ability that silences an area of effect around them, so perhaps if you played enough Blood Elves or you played a Blood Elf of a certain cost, you could have a silence effect on an enemy minion or several enemy minions. Something like that could be kind of cool, but it's unlikely that we're going to see it anytime soon. Our next racial tribe is the Draenei. Now the Draenei were originally part of the Eridar race, but when Kil'jaeden and Archimonde tried to get the Eridar to join the Burning Legion, the Draenei split off along with Prophet Velen because they saw the evil in Sargeras and the rest of them. While again we can see the Draenei on some cards in Hearthstone like Alder Peacekeeper or of course Prophet Velen and Priest, they're not really suited to tribal synergies as much, so we probably won't see them being a card type unless we get some sort of Draenei versus Burning Legion type expansion, maybe if they were to visit Argus in the future. What could be kind of cool though is that Draenei's do have a passive that does heal, so perhaps, you know, Draenei units could heal themselves or each other if you were to play a lot of them together. And maybe a future expansion that explores the races and how they could synergize together could be very cool in the future, especially since so many cards could already have those existing racial tags, they just have to be added on. Sort of like how Frost Elemental became an Elemental after the fact, even though it didn't originally have that tag. Up next, we have the Dwarves. Now we see a ton of Dwarves both in Warcraft lore and in the game of Hearthstone, so it would definitely be cool to see some sort of mechanic where they could work together. We already did see a lot of Dwarves in Blackrock Mountain, so we might not get to see something like this in the future, but potentially something exploring the Dark Iron Dwarves further, or just the Dwarves of Ironforge could be very cool to get some Dwarf-themed cards in the future and create another one of those tribal synergies. In World of Warcraft, dwarves have stone form, which removes bleed, poisons, and disease effects and reduces the damage they take, so maybe dwarves could have some sort of powerful damage reduction ability at the cost of stats or other powerful abilities on their cards. Up next we have both the Goblins and the Gnomes, and while both races are pretty sweet, the fact that we already got an expansion literally named Goblins and Gnomes means that the prospects for either to be added as a tribe at this point are probably not too good. Both are definitely races that will continue appearing pretty frequently on cards as far as we can tell, and it would have been very cool to see some sort of racial synergy between them back when GVG first came out. But that was back in the game's infancy and there was still a lot to be explored. I feel like if that kind of expansion did come out at this point in time, it might definitely be an entirely different expansion. Next up, it's the humans. So humans are definitely a popular tribe and one that could get some kind of synergy. The only problem is that Paladin already kind of explores that design space and flavor with things like Quartermaster that buffs their Silver Hand recruits. And it might be pretty weird for a game with as few tribes as Hearthstone having pretty similar synergies with different types of cards and tribes. Although there are a ton of humans in the game, if they all were labeled as such and the tribe got synergies, it could be really strong since there are just so many of them compared to a lot of the other races. Up next, we have Night Elves, Orcs, and the Tauren. The reason these are grouped is because while they're all important tribes and they're all represented on legendaries or heroes in the game, none of them really have much of a reason to have a tribal synergy. Hearthstone only labels cards with tribes when they have a flavorful reason to have synergies like elementals or murlocs, and this is pretty good design philosophy and likely one that they're going to stick with. So while we'll keep seeing Night Elves, Orcs, and Tauren on the cards, there's probably not a reason to expect them to be tribes in the future. But if we did, then maybe Night Elves could have some sort of stealth mechanic like they do in World of Warcraft with Shadow Meld, and maybe Taurens could introduce a new mechanic that disables enemy units, since in World of Warcraft they do have an AoE stun. Up next, we have the Trolls. Trolls already appear on quite a few cards in the game, like Sen'jin Shieldmaster, and although they would be a great addition to the game, it's a little unclear what type of synergy they could have. However, we could also explore cards that don't necessarily have synergy with their race, but instead just a similar design throughout all of the cards with that same tag. Trolls have been somewhat underexplored in Hearthstone so far, but they're exactly the right size to get tribal synergies. They're not too big like the humans, and they're not too obscure either, like, you know, the evil eyes, like the Watcher. And a troll sub-theme would be something pretty unsurprising to see in a future expansion, since in World of Warcraft, an expansion that features trolls pretty heavily is usually received very, very well. Up next, of course, it's Undead. Undead's actually in a weird place in Hearthstone in general, because while they do have a lot of lore and a lot of potential cards, they don't necessarily have a good place to go. They don't necessarily belong in any classes except ones that don't exist yet, like maybe the Death Knights, and making them neutral is a little weird since classes like Paladin, Priest, and Druid really shouldn't be using Undead. But maybe we'll see some Undead in the future, and they could have very cool effects like Death Rattles, but something would have to change with one of the classes flavor-wise first, so that it makes sense for them to have Undead minions. Next, it's Worgens. And while we're probably not going to see a Worgen tribe since there's far too few of them, the Worgen mechanic seems to be gaining attack or other abilities when enraged, so maybe we will see a legendary Worgen that gets a ton of different abilities when enraged at some point in the future. It would also be cool to see some sort of transformation effect like you do have in Werewolves and Magic the Gathering, where when you fulfill a certain thing like attacking the enemy hero or just staying on the board for a turn, it can transform and become a stronger version of itself. That could also be a really cool place to explore the Worgens, where they basically transform from their, human form to their true form. Up next, we're getting outside of the World of Warcraft races with Nerubians, an old and cunning race of giant spiders with a rich culture and history. We see a decent amount of Nerubians in Hearthstone in things like the Nerubian egg or a new Barak. And although they seem unlikely to get any tribal support as of now, they definitely have a running theme in them where it is a death rattle that leaves behind a very valuable effect, like Nerubian Egg spawning the 4/4 for just 2 mana, or a new Barak leaving behind a 4/4 and returning to your hand, so it definitely could affect future Nerubian cards. Last but not least, it's Ogres. Ogres were in the game at some point, and there's definitely a decent amount of Ogres in Hearthstone so far, and a lot of them have the 50% chance to attack the wrong minion mechanic. Now, we probably won't see Ogre as a creature type anytime soon, but it would be cool to get more things that could interact with this mechanic, like maybe an Ogre Seer that allows your Ogres to attack the correct target, or maybe an Ogre that gives you a ton of spell damage, but it also gives you a chance for your spells to miss and hit the wrong target, so that you could have a very high risk, high reward mechanic in the game that's also very fun. That's kind of how the Ogres have always been, not necessarily too strong, but definitely cool flavor-wise, and sometimes a powerful pickup in Arena, and so something like that with those mechanics could be explored. Now, one thing I would really love to see with the races in World of Warcraft, as opposed to just tribal synergies, are maybe some sort of tavern brawl, where instead of playing your regular minions, you're playing these champions of different races, and all of them have abilities that go very hand in hand with their race. So you play Night Elf characters that can stealth, or you play Troll characters that can enrage themselves, where you really feel like you're fighting in a PvP type battle, maybe in Arathi Basin, which is kind of the most iconic battleground from World of Warcraft, where instead of these minions at your disposal, you're just controlling these huge champions of the races, and they all really feel like they are true to their race. Something like that could be very cool as opposed to just the regular tribal mechanic we see in Hearthstone, but I'd like to know what you guys think. If there are any tribes that should be added to existing cards that could also be supported in future expansions that you think could add a lot to the game. I love hearing from you guys all the time, and I'll make sure to check out the comments. But that's going to be it for me today. Thank you guys so much for watching, and I'll see you next time.